right, welcome everybody. I'm David Eaton. I'm one of the nurse practitioners at Seattle Children's Autism Center. I've helped out Jim Mancini, who's the usual host of the Autism 200 lectures. Occasionally when he's out on vacation right now, and so I'm filling in for him tonight. A few kind of housekeeping kind of things before we get started. We are streaming live on Facebook Live, and then that video will stay on Facebook. It kind of immediately gets you can review it later at a later date. So if any of you are either on Facebook or here in person or asking questions, just kind of keep that in mind. No personal information, at least that you don't want out there. So kind of de-identifying questions and kind of not too much specifics that you would feel uncomfortable with having in any sort of social media setting. So keep that in mind if you're asking questions, but we don't want that to discourage questions. So definitely feel free to ask away. Let's see. Autism, we have our Autism 200 tonight. Somebody earlier was just asking a minute ago, what is Autism 200? And the idea is that, from a college perspective, your introduction classes are like autism or 100 level courses. And then kind of the second level of after your first year of introduction to different college courses, your second year of college courses are like 200 level courses. So these Autism 200 series lectures are different kind of subtopics in autism. It's not a general autism discussion tonight, and each month when we have our Autism 200, it's not a general autism discussion. It's a real specific topic that we try and get into a lot more detail about. So these summertime lectures, this month and next month in August, the last several years in the summer, we've focused on transition into the adult years, and so adult-related topics has been our focus in these summer lectures. So without further ado, I'll read up kind of a little introduction information. Tonight we have Dora Raymaker. She's a PhD researcher at Portland State University. Almost got it wrong. She researches at the Regional Research Institute and is the co-director of the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education. So the acronym for that is ASPIRE with two A's at the beginning. I think you talk about that in the slides. You'll see more information about ASPIRE as we go. She's also the associate editor of the Journal of Autism and Adulthood, an organization for autism research scientific council, and a member, she's a member of that council, and she is an autistic person herself. Dr. Raymaker's research interests include community-engaged practice, systems thinking, measurement adaptation, and dynamics at the intersection of science, society, and public policy. There we go, there's the intersection. In her application, Dr. Raymaker conducts interventions and services, research in collaboration with disability and mental health communities, and the goal of that is to improve health, well-being, employment, huge topic there, self-determination, and reduce stigma in the autism community. Tonight, Dr. Raymaker will, her remaining time that she has, Dr. Raymaker writes fiction with neurodivergent heroes, including science fiction mystery novel called Hoshi and the Red City Circuit. So is that on your website? Go check out her website if you want to find out more about that part. Tonight, we're going to be talking about autistic burnout. The title is My Physical Body and Mind Started Shutting Down. And without further ado, to introduce that topic to you all and talk about it, we'll have Dr. Raymaker come on up.
So thank you so much for having me. As stated, I'm faculty at Portland State University's Regional Research Institute for Human Services in the School of Social Work. And although I conduct research with clinical populations, specifically with autistic mental health and developmental disability populations, I'm a systems science, not a clinician. Just so you know, I won't know the questions about those clinical details, although there are clinicians on my research team who are a part of this work. I conduct social services intervention research, so I look at ways that social service systems can change to better serve individuals and communities. And all of my work is done in collaboration with people from the communities that are being affected by this work. So sometimes, like in the case of Aspire, which is responsible for the burnout research I'm going to talk to you about tonight, I'm also a member of the community too. Not always, but I am in this case. So, and as you can see from this baby picture, I've kind of been a long time bit of a subversive civil rights, human rights advocate. And my ongoing goal is always science for social change. I think it is possible. So I want to tell you a little more about Aspire before I get into the burnout discussion, because this research was really developed and conducted by Aspire, even though I'm here representing it. So Aspire is a research group that I co-founded with Christina Nicolaitis. She's a physician researcher and a parent, 13 years ago. And she'd been following me on this autistic parents list. She's the parent, and I was just there kind of trying to help parents to better understand their children. And she decided she wanted to meet me. And being the really, really wise person she is, she realized that an invitation to unstructured social time was probably not going to work so well. So she created this autism journal club to lure me into meeting with her. And we read maybe about 3 research papers before issues became really overwhelming. So it was autism research that was not useful or relevant to our lives, faulty research designs because the researchers didn't understand enough about what it was like to be autistic, research that stigmatized, stereotyped, or further marginalized autistic people, and research that even caused harm. So Christina was at the time doing this community-based participatory research with the African American and Latina communities. And she realized that one could kind of substitute African American for autistic in these conversations, and the issues in research would really be the same. So we decided to stop complaining and do something about it. So community-based participatory research, which is the research that she was using in her violence and depression projects with these other communities, was invented largely to address exactly these types of problems. CBPR is an emancipatory approach to research and inquiry. There are a lot of different and related ways of conducting community-engaged research. CBPR is just one of them that developed mostly in public health. And it's very, very well known and well accepted within the field of public health at this point. CBPR takes an equitable approach to research. So the idea is that community members serve as co-researchers with the academics in all phases of the work. That includes deciding what to study, how to study it, developing the research materials and collecting data, and all the way through to the interpretation and the dissemination of findings. The lived experience and community knowledge of the non-academic partners is valued equally to academic expertise. It's a different kind of knowledge, but it is of equal value. And autistic adult and other community members from Aspire's team were involved in all stages of the autistic burnout work I'm going to talk with you about today. So this is all of the team's research. So 12 years later, here we are. Aspire is a team of autistic people, academics, family members, healthcare providers, and disability service professionals. Some of us, like myself, are in overlapping roles. We work in partnership with a number of academic and community organizations, and we're always happy to collaborate with more. And 12 years and multiple NIH-funded projects, we have a lot of learning behind us, and I'm really incredibly proud of what we've done. So currently we have 3 main active areas of research. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Autistic Burnout study, which is exploratory research to understand and define autistic burnout and to begin working toward how to measure it. But we're also working on autism in professional employment. Particularly, we're looking more broadly than just information technology fields. And we've completed an exploratory study to understand things that help people be successful in employment, and have just received, I'm very excited, new funding to begin intervention development. So this first little piece is to specifically target toward workplace culture change to make workplace cultures more accepting to autistic professionals. And then the area that we've been working on the longest this whole time is healthcare for autistic adults. And the Aspire Healthcare Toolkit for Primary Healthcare is available free online. That's at autismandhealth.org. And we've also started working on adapting some of that for use in emergency departments and hospitals. And in the Q&A later, I'm absolutely happy to talk about all of these studies and all of these topics. They're all relevant to transitions and adulthood, and I'm proud of them all. So, all right, so onto the burnout study. So now that all that background and framing is done, first I'm going to cover what is autistic burnout and why does it need research. And then briefly I'll explain the methods of the study, and then I'll get into kind of the meat of what we've learned so far about autistic burnout from the study, and the implications and recommendations for other autistic people, families, and clinicians based on what we know so far. And then lastly, there should be plenty of time for questions and discussion. Like I say, I'm happy to both discuss the burnout work and any of Aspire's other work. So what is autistic burnout and why does it need research? The phrase autistic burnout is used a lot in the autistic community. That's the community of autistic and young adults, and has been used by us for many, many years. And it's applied to this feeling of utter exhaustion and loss of ability that may share some similarities with professional burnout, only it's like applied to every area of daily life instead of just to your job. And some people also refer to it or describe it as autistic regression, although that term is a bit problematic, particularly when you're talking about adults. Regardless of what it's called, autistic adults report times in their lives, including during childhood, adolescence, particularly around transition points, where they experience exhaustion so great that they can no longer cope as before and lose skills or functions they previously had, act or feel more autistic, lose jobs, can't maintain school, can't maintain relationships, mental and physical health, sometimes develop chronic health conditions, permanent disability, or become suicidal. And so something is clearly happening here, but what? So there are a lot of unanswered questions about these experiences. For example, is there a clear definition of autistic burnout? If so, is it different from these other kinds of burnout, like professional burnout? Is it different from depression? And most importantly, for doing something to stop it, why does it happen and how can it be relieved or prevented? So as I say, autistic people have experienced it and have some sense for some of these answers. So we've discussed our experiences pretty extensively on social media and in community spaces and shared thoughts and strategies for how to recognize it, prevent it, or cope with it. We've talked about it as a source of distress, as resulting in these poor life outcomes. We often connect it to extreme stress or stressful life changes, as well as to the stress of masking, which is having to behave or pass as a non-autistic person or a non-disabled person in order to meet external expectations. Understanding and relieving or preventing autistic burnout is an exceptionally high priority for autistic adults. Browsing hashtag autistic burnout on Twitter will give you a taste for that urgency, as well as some examples for the kinds of conversations that go on in the community about it. But knowing one's own experience of autistic burnout and sharing strategies isn't necessarily enough to understand what to do about it, either systematically or in response to individual need. So here's one person's tweet. I told my therapist I think I'm having autistic burnout. She agreed, and that's as far as we got. What helps? Help me. I'm begging you, please. Despite this urgency, though, the published research on autism and burnout is all on family, teacher, and caregiver burnout. None is on the burnout of autistic people ourselves or on people with disabilities in general. None of it is about, and a lot of it is also known, there's a lot known about professional burnout, including in populations that also have high rates of masking and suicidality, like physicians. For physicians, masking, in their case, they have to hide their feelings about the human suffering and trauma that they see daily and remain outwardly emotionally grounded and compassionate toward patients and families, is connected to increased burnout. And that burnout is connected to increased physician suicide. So this is stuff we know. And it's very important to know this when developing interventions to reduce burnout, mental health distress, and suicide for physicians. But there's been no scientific exploration yet into whether similar mechanisms may be happening for autistic adults, which have a huge rate of suicide, despite some similar risk factors like the increased need for masking. So understanding where autistic burnout fits within this existing burnout literature could be really important in addressing it. So more concretely, we don't have enough information yet to answer that tweeter's question to their therapist and to the world of what helps. We have to start somewhere, so this is where my team started. So this is the Aspire Autistic Burnout Study. So the aims of our research were just to first characterize autistic burnout. What is it? What does it look like? And to qualitatively understand people's experience of it and their ideas for strategies to prevent it or to recover from it. And then using that information and the existing literature on burnout where applicable to develop and begin validating a measure of autistic burnout. And we see these as our first steps because before we do any more applied intervention or services work, we need to know if anything that we're doing to try to fix the problem has actually worked. So we need a way to kind of figure out what to do and detect if we've done it. So for that first aim, to just try and define and understand the characteristics of autistic burnout, we took 3 sources of data. I have my little pointer that I know Facebook can't see. The 3 sources of data describing people's lived experiences with autistic burnout, and we analyzed them qualitatively. We then are using what we learned from that analysis to create and pilot test this measure, and we're going to test it with about 50 autistic adults, and then we'll hopefully be able to use the findings from all parts of the study, both to begin disseminating information and recommendations like through this talk here, and also to use the pilot data from this study and the new measure to support future research regarding what can be done to better support autistic people in avoiding or recovering from burnout. And I asked Gary if I should avoid the science, and he told me no, some small amount of science is good. So here you go. So our data sources, we had, it came from these 3. So the first one was 9 from our skilled employment interviews where people discussed autistic burnout just spontaneously, even though we didn't ask them about that. And that was from 45 autistic adults who had professional training. It was a national sample with community-based recruiting. And then we did 10 new interviews that were focused very specifically on autistic burnout. Again, a national sample, community-based recruitment. And we purposefully sampled to fit some demographics that weren't covered in the employment interviews. And for that interview, we started, the bulk of it was just a tell me your story. Like, what happened when you experienced burnout? What did it feel like? What were the consequences on your life? Did you get out of it? If so, how? It was sort of a narrative story about people's experiences. And then we just asked them flat out, how would you define it? What are the 3 things that would have to be present for you to know that this is autistic burnout? And then we asked them again flat out, what strategies or advice would you give other autistic people, and what strategies or advice would you give family members or other people in their lives? And then our third source was 19 key public online media sources. So this was blogs, videos, Twitter hashtag autistic burnout, and some Instagram resources that were compiled by our autistic community partners. So we asked the community, what do we have to look at? And that list of 19. And then we also followed threads off of those blogs, which I don't have a tidy count of yet. Analysis, so we did a thematic analysis, which means that we read everything and looked across all of our data sources for recurrent, strong, and pervasive ideas that were just coming up over and over and over again. And we're looking at ideas, not just categories. And we analyzed at both semantic and Latin levels, so that means that we took people's word at face value, but we also inferred some underlying meanings that maybe weren't stated explicitly based on the context of their story and broader social context. We viewed it as a critical paradigm, so reality as represented by these interviews, we saw as a product of an interaction between a participant and the researcher, and it's positioned within the broader context of the world. For verification, we have multiple coders who are working on it. We meet regularly to discuss what we found. We have member checking, so our Aspire community partners have been looking at this and saying, yeah, that rings true, or no, I don't think so. And triangulation with other data sources that are out there. Community-based participatory research. Yeah. So the current status, we have completed all of our data collection. We are mostly done with the analysis, like 90% done with the analysis. And we're starting, the dissemination piece. We have not yet created the measure, so that will be, yeah.
Do you need volunteers?
We will need volunteers when we get to this stage, yes. and you can, if anybody wants to participate in Aspire's research studies, you can email me. And we keep a little list of people who might be interested. So
Last slide, right?
it's on the last slide, and also after the talk, if you want, I have business cards and like ways. And the last slide will be left up during the Q&A, so you can photograph it or write it down there as well. Also, I have my amazing research assistant is here, so you can also give it to her. Okay, so what have we learned so far? So here's just who we heard from, just to describe and frame the findings. So we heard from people all over the country. The orange is the burnout interviews and the green employment. We tried to sample in the burnout interviews for some demographics that weren't represented in the employment interviews. Particularly, we wanted a lower educational attainment, and we also needed more males. It's actually really hard to get males to participate in research, so even though there's a gender imbalance in autism, we can always use male research participants. Both sets of interviews contained a mix of people who used alternative methods to speech at times, and who used disability services, and both had people from a really wide range of ages. We don't have any demographic data at this time on the social media authors, but we looked at those 19 primary sources and their threads. So what I'm about to go through for our findings is combined findings from analysis of all three of those sources. Yeah. Alternative and augmentative communication, so alternative forms of communication to speech, so like writing or letterboards or typed text-to-speech, anything that's not blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to start this section with one person's description of what the experience of autistic burnout is like. This is from Kieran. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right because I've only read it, on their public blog, The Autistic Advocate, from 2018. And it's one person's description, but it's also a very good representative example of the experiences that people described in our interviews. So our qualitative findings will begin to unpack this. So this combination of stress, masking, social isolation, loss of an important support person, along with the overwhelming confusion of what was wrong with me, why I couldn't really connect with anyone, why people singled me out or played tricks or used me, of what the hell was wrong with me, and why I just kept hitting this wall over and over again, was what led me to crash and burn out. My physical body and mind started shutting down. I could feel each system in my body closing off as gravity got heavier than it had ever been. I didn't know what to do, did not understand what was happening to me. I had no way to communicate this. It was like a switch had gone off. My verbal ability to convey what was going on in my mind and body was gone. I did not want to die. I've never wanted to die. I needed to step out. I needed to remove myself from the environment and take myself elsewhere. I needed to escape. But the only way I knew how to do that was to die. So I tried. So a number of these components or features of autistic burnout in our data were echoed in that experience that I just read. So almost everyone talked about a loss of skills, including cognitive skills, executive function skills. So this is sequencing, organizing, understanding what steps to take, memory, speech and communication, general ability to cope, overall ability to do things that one was once able to do, like instrumental activities of daily living. So going to the grocery store, cleaning the house, etc. Many people talked about increased sensitivity, so especially to sensory stimulus. One participant related having to quit their job as a CNA because they became hypersensitive to the sound of the oxygen machine. Sensory overload, increased sensitivity to change or social interaction or social stimulus. Participants reported increased autistic behaviors such as more stimming and more difficulties with speech. And they reported more frequent meltdowns and shutdowns, and also just this chronic exhaustion, a weariness to keep trying. So this is a qualitative study, and it's not designed to find statistical causality. But the data did pervasively describe a specific list of reasons behind autistic burnout that people talked about. And most heavily was this idea of external expectations chronically outweighing the person's ability to meet them. And related, because it's one strategy for meeting mainstream social expectations, is this chronic masking or repressing one's autistic behavior in order to pass as non-disabled or non-autistic. Also change, stress from change, stress, anything that would require additional effort to cope with, kind of like flipped that switch and passed over this sort of threshold of how much effort could be done into a collapse. And another pervasive theme related to causes is this inability to recover quickly enough from the strains to meet the expectations, constantly mask, cope with stress, change, the unexpected. So these themes are like rarely spoken of in isolation from each other, but sort of in feedback with each other, because as one thing gets compromised, it makes another thing more difficult. As you have to do one thing more, it's more effort. So I'm a systems person, so I'm always making dynamics models. And this is not a finished or a final model, and I'm not happy with it yet, but it's just a start of playing with possible dynamics. The reason why I like looking at dynamics models is because if we can understand the structure of what's going on with something, it often suggests where we can make a change to that structure that will then change the overall behavior of what's going on. So I'm just going to quickly run through these loops one at a time in terms of what people are describing. So I'm first going to just look at this little top loop. So starting with the ability to cope and mask, the more ability you have to cope and mask, the more people will expect of you, and then the more you have to continue to cope and mask. Now I'm going to follow this medium-sized one, and I'm going to start here at resources for coping and masking. So the more resources that you have to do this coping and masking, the more you're going to get social financial rewards, a job, social acceptance, those types of things. The more you're going to be expected to be able to do that, the more you have to use that ability to cope and mask. But using the ability is going to drain your resources for having it. Okay, now I'm going to go around the big one. So starting here, like the more you use your ability to cope and mask, the more it's going to exhaust you. The more exhausted you are, the less energy you have. The less energy you have, the less resources you have to cope and mask. The less resources you have, they slip here. This is where the burnout happens. Your social financial rewards disappear and everything comes crashing down. So that's a thought. It's like I say, this is my early thoughts. You're getting my very early thoughts on this research. So.
Totally understand it's a very early thought on the energy to resource.
No, it's a plus because this is like, yeah, so the question, I probably shouldn't have put the pluses and minuses in, but I kind of had to do it for my own thinking. A plus means that an increase or a decrease between the two follows. So if this goes down, this also goes down. If this goes up, this also goes up. So it's an exponential increase, whereas the minus means it balances. So if this goes up, this goes down.
And also, can you explain what the others?
Yeah, these are balancing feedback loops. So it's going to create what the behavior will look like is that you'll do more and more and more, and then reach a point where you just can't do anymore, and it levels out. So and the increasing loop, it's just going to go exponentially up. So these all get checked and balanced, and that is a beautiful segue into the other side of this, which is that this type of dynamic actually leads to this type of behavior. It's called a growth and collapse type behavior, where a system grows faster than the available resources can keep up with it, and then it crashes and burns. So that's sort of, if you look at, your ability to cope and mask as being on this line, that's your ability to cope and mask, and that's where the, burnout comes in, and you can't anymore, and you lose skills, and you act more autistic. It's, again, just playing with ideas. But I like this stuff because if you can start to understand what's really going on in dynamics, then you can say something like, okay, wait a minute, maybe we need to have less masking, or maybe we need to lower expectations, or maybe we need to add some support piece into this, or change the structure so that it doesn't do this anymore. Anyway, so impacts on life. That was a little abstract, so that was okay. Going back into a more concrete ways people said this impacted their lives. They lost their job, they lost their social standing, they lost their sense of belonging in the community. They found that others didn't understand, like, you could do this yesterday, why can't you do it today? And that created problems. There was reduced self-esteem and self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is like your confidence that you can actually do a thing. Self-esteem is self-worth. There was increased depression, anxiety, mental health outcomes, and self-injury and suicidality. So what people described how it worked, they talked about timing at multiple points in life, maybe childhood, not quite sure. But most people's first story of autistic burnout actually happened around puberty or post-puberty, so transition age or just before. And then at other points of increased independence, so like starting high school, starting college, starting a new job, a new relationship. Sometimes it was good things. So then maybe there's a period of stability. There's sort of like a age 20-ish range, 30, where people seem to have a lot of energy and be able to maintain. But then at points of increased stress, if something happens, that all burns. Or also aging. The older people got, the less energy they had to kind of keep up with stuff. And there was a sense that these things happened more often as they got older. People described pretty much uniformly a collapse and retreat to recover. And often, especially later in life, they talked about an incomplete recovery. So they would recover from that acute burnout, but they never really got back all of the skills that they felt they had before it had happened. People talked about types. Are there types of it? I don't know. Again, this is early research, but some people talked about kind of low-level, constant burnout that they were in all the time. Some people talked about really intense, acute moments of it where it just blasted their whole life. And then some people kind of talked about like a social burnout, like maybe that piece gets burned out, but the other parts don't. So we have a professional burnout researcher on our team. So we've been looking at like, is this the same thing or is this different? Professional burnout is characterized by exhaustion, depersonalization, which is like distancing yourself from your job and your work and like kind of not caring about the job you're doing anymore, and reduced self-efficacy. So that's, again, reduced feelings confidence that you can do your job. There's a lot of evidence in our data for the exhaustion and reduced self-efficacy. There's virtually none for depersonalization. So it would have been nice if there was a perfect overlap, but I'm not sure that there is. So we've also looked at autistic burnout versus depression. We have a psychiatrist on our team, so we've been looking at this kind of carefully. There's some overlap, like feelings of worthlessness, the exhaustion again. It's probably insufficient overlap to be the same. It didn't include, for example, the slowed or speeded movement or those types of like depression-related sleep disturbances. It notably didn't include anhedonia, which is sort of that not caring or not feeling. If anything, there was a lot of frustration people expressed because they continued to care, feel, and want, but they felt incapable of taking any action on that because they were just so tired and couldn't do it. And some participants who had a diagnosis of depression actually took care to differentiate it from their burnout when they spoke to us. So probably not the same. So our research team is still a little bit away from a formal definition, but the people we've talked with and the stories that are shared online have summarized autistic burnout pretty clearly. So I'm just going to give you 3 responses to the question in our interview of how would you define autistic burnout. So this first is very operational and detailed. So autistic burnout is a state of physical and mental fatigue, heightened stress, and diminished capacity to manage life skills, sensory input, and/or social interactions, which comes from years of being severely overtaxed by the strain of trying to live up to demands that are out of sync with our needs. So another participant gave it to us in an analogy that I think they were hoping non-autistic people might be able to relate to. It's like promoting a neurotypical person beyond their own skill level until they flop, only times 100 and sometimes more. And lastly, really succinctly, autistic burnout is having all your internal resources exhausted beyond measure and being left with no cleanup crew. So, what's it mean and what can we do about it? What helps? What is the answer to that tweet? So I was invited here to talk with you all, I'm assuming because I'm a scientist, and conducting research with a team of academic and clinical experts, which gives a certain amount of authority to the information. And I'm not going to knock science, obviously, that's what I do. And I also think it's very necessary to examine data with a critical eye and a systematic process because it's all too easy to jump to misleading conclusions otherwise. But autistic burnout is also a problem that autistic people have been dealing with constantly in their lives, and that's a kind of expertise too. There's a vast amount of community wisdom that's been built up as we talk with each other about our experiences and try to communicate about them more broadly with others. So one example is this infographic from Carla Fisher's ASD page. And it's got some similar stuff to what we found. If it's hard to read, I'll just run through it quickly. So what is it? Late onset loss of functionality due to sustained monumental efforts. Happens to many young ASD adults and many more all the way up into 50 or 60 years, I would argue probably longer. Often directly related to failing at fitting in with neurotypical social skills despite faking it all the time to make it. So Carla says that an ASD adult needs to know basic polite skills, but they also need to know acceptance for who they are. They need protection. They need friends who get them. Education on awareness and advocacy, mentorship, and vocational training in a strength area. So you can do something that you're good at. It doesn't require tons of effort. Carla says to never assume social skills learned in a classroom will work outside the classroom. She says never underestimate how hard it is to be someone you are not neurologically meant to be. She says never assume that NT social skills are the only way to success and or integration in society. She says never underestimate the importance of like people or friends for social interactions and practicing ASD social skills, so hanging out with each other. And never believe the books have all the answers. Ask about autistic burnout on forums where there are autistic adults. The resources for understanding and dealing with autistic burnout are also very rapidly evolving in the community. For example, this new resource on strategies for avoiding or coping with burnout was published less than a month ago at the Queen of the Drowned blog. Autism Women's Network put out the resource on the right, which is likely too small to see. So I brought a copy that I could read. And again, you're going to hear a lot of the same stuff. So signs, lack of motivation, hard to care about goals when everyday life is overwhelming, loss of executive functioning abilities, difficulty with self-care, easier to reach overload or meltdown, loss of speech, selective mutism, lethargy, exhaustion, illness, digestive issues, memory loss, inability to maintain masks or use social skills, overall seeming more autistic, may have a period of high energy before collapse. This resource has causes, which again, we're going to sound like a lot of what we found in our more sciencey stuff. Passing as neurotypical or suppressing autistic traits, doing too much stress, aging, needing more downtime, having less energy, changes good or bad, sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, dehydration, illness, sensory emotional overload. And then the strategies that resource lists are time, scheduling breaks, managing your daily resources, taking a leave of absence, stimming more, having a sensory diet, exercise, massage, reminders and supports, routines, getting into a better environment or job, boundaries and saying no, dropping the mask facade, spending time alone, being quiet, creative projects, passions, and pursuing special interests, and paying attention to the reactions of your own body and mind. So much of the content of these resources is supported in our research, which gives me a kind of funny sense of deja vu, because back when Aspire first started and wanted to work on improving healthcare for autistic adults, nobody would fund us until we had shown that autistic adults did indeed have worse healthcare than other adults. Which, to the autistic adults and family members in this room, I'm sure it is kind of ridiculous that was even a question. But okay, so we went out, we did a study that asked if autistic adults had worse health care than others, and oh my goodness, they did. But honestly, the data from that study has actually really helped push forward substantial effort to improve health care well outside of the little, the stuff that we work on. So although the strategies I'm going to go run through next are based on our scientific findings rather than these community resources, I really want to stress that they're very consistent with the work that is being done outside of formal research by autistic adults with lived experience. And not to throw that out because it's not science. All right, so here's what's in our data so far, much of which I said is echoed in those community sources. Since we only spoke to people who experienced burnout, our focus was on what helped people recover more so than prevention. Perhaps not surprisingly, time off from school, job, and life helped, as did reduced expectations from both external sources and from oneself, being more self-forgiving. Time spent stimming or engaging in special interests. For example, one participant talked about taking long dancing walks with their favorite music and a comfort item. Sensory or social withdrawal, although time spent in social interactions with other autistic people or with people who were understanding and empathetic and eager to engage in the person's special interest also helped. In general, just being able to take off the mask and stop that effort of suppressing autistic behavior was helpful to people's recovery. And lastly, in addition to all of these strategies, just time. Like, you don't do this and feel better. It takes time to recover. Our research participants and online sources also had recommendations for things that family, friends, and other important people can do to help recovery or to potentially reduce the risk of it happening. I sound like a broken record at this point about the reduced external expectations, but it's probably clear why. Abilities outpacing expectations is that theme across everything. Also, other people can accept the autistic person without the mask. Having people around who are accepting and who can provide emotional support and empathic connections without demanding even more were very important in many of the narratives of recovery. Really, really important. Physical support was helpful. For example, just helping with those things like grocery shopping or cleaning the house to give the person a brief little break. And lastly, providing disability accommodations in order to just relieve the amount of extra effort and energy that the person is spending just trying to function in an environment that isn't meeting their needs. Expanding out into kind of broader world beyond the individual experiencing the burnout in their immediate circle, there are some potential wider considerations regarding what to do. The perceived and actual need to mask and cope with a world that is not set up for one's way of thinking and sensing is driven in part by discrimination and stigma around autistic behavior. So anti-discrimination and anti-stigma work might be a broader leverage point. Therapy and other structures with explicit normalization goals may need to be rethought a little bit. On a brighter note, system-level changes that normalize disability might help reduce overall risk of burnout. For example, just being more visible as people with disabilities in the community and community settings like job and schools pushes forward this idea that disability is natural and okay. Regardless of where system shifts might have the most leverage, professional, clinical, family, or self-advocate communities, everybody could just benefit from, I think, a deeper understanding of and just discussing this, bringing this out into the open. So I know this is largely a child-focused or transition age-focused lecture series. I always feel a little bit nervous speaking to child-focused audiences because most of my work is with adults. But there are some very clear transition age considerations that emerged from our data that I think are important. So many of the adults we talked to or whose stories we read experienced their first autistic burnout at transition age. And this may be a particularly vulnerable time because of the increase in expectations as well as the typical, but also very stressful amount of developmental and environmental changes that just happened to everyone around that time. So in the stories that we analyzed, people related mostly not having any idea what was happening to them that first time, and it was very scary for some. And some of them, it led to significant mental health crisis and even hospitalization. And in multiple cases, people related that the burnout was what led to them getting an ASD diagnosis in the first place. So if there was a silver lining in some of this, a lot of people were saying, you know, the good part of my burnout was that I finally got the ASD diagnosis and understood what was going on with me. These are just two little narratives from the transition age stuff. So one person said, I was intellectually gifted, but emotionally and socially way behind my age. I burned out completely at age 14 from stress, socializing issues, and the start of an erratic puberty. Only now do I see it as burnout. And another story. It actually started in middle school. My sensory issues got a lot worse. Then I started socially withdrawing, like hanging out in my room and going into shutdown. And then my parents were really concerned because they thought I was depressed. And for that instance of burnout, afterwards, I never got to the point where I was before. Like I couldn't deal with sensory issues the same way. I went from having no diagnosis of autism to having a diagnosis of autism, so it was a significant point in my life. I think that instance of burnout was caused by the social differences and interaction of a teenager versus pre-adolescent years. So just some things to think about with younger people. All right, so as I put together this talk, I realized that telling people to reduce expectations, burnout is caused by inability to meet expectations, needs to be taken very, very much in the context of the types of expectations that people described in their stories. And I feel this is really critical to add because all too often there are reduced expectations for autistic people and others with disabilities that lead also to reduced opportunities and a cascade of other failures leading to reduced and poor life outcomes, and which can be very discriminatory. So in our data, expectations were never things like my intelligence or my ability to succeed in my chosen field of interest and employment or taking care of my children. Indeed, finding good fits with school, work, activities, family, and community, and obtaining reasonable accommodations to support disability and reduce that unsustainable effort of masking were often named as ways to prevent or help people recover from burnout. So the expectations in our data were almost always the expectations to do all of the things that non-autistic people can do in the same way that they do them. So just, in other words, do expect us to be able to achieve our dreams. Just don't expect us to always achieve them in the same way that a non-autistic person would. I asked the Aspire team for key takeaway points that they felt I should leave you with, especially the family members and professionals from our work, and this is what they said. So these points are taken from partners who identify variously as autistic family members or academics and also clinicians. So again, the more people need to mask, the more likely they are to experience burnout. Educate yourself about disability rights and cultivate positive autistic or disability identity. Teach young people to pace themselves and to set flexible boundaries for themselves so that as resources change, they can flex with it. Focus on autistic strengths and perseverations to reduce the risk of burnout. For example, choose activities or employment that are in alignment with special interest. And I would add too, seeking out people who are your own kind, whether they are autistic or not. Be sensitive to the possibility that decreases in function. So when someone can do something at one point in time, but is unable to do the same thing at another time, this may be a sign of autistic burnout. Because I have to say it, the study has some limitations. Mainly, most importantly, it was a very small qualitative study with a convenient sample, and the burnout-specific interviews are missing some very important demographics. It was also designed to get an in-depth understanding from experts. It was not intended to generalize to a population. This is preliminary exploratory work, and the analysis and interpretation presented here is actually still developing and has not been finalized. It's close enough to the end, so I feel good about presenting it, but when you read the final paper, it may be a bit different. So next steps, where do we go from here? More research is needed, measure development, increased understanding of the causes and associations, I think a greater understanding of role and suicidality. And then after understanding, we need things that are going to relieve or prevent it. More conversation is needed. Autistic people have been talking about this experience amongst ourselves for a really long time, and I think it's time to broaden that discussion outside the community so it can gain more potential for action. And then, just consider if there's something you can do to help prevent autistic burnout in your own or someone else's life. So, before we go into questions, I want to give a big thanks to the Aspire team for all their work, as well as to our research participants whose generosity in sharing their experiences is critical to everything. I'm also going to make a shameless plug for this new journal, Autism in Adulthood, which I'm the assistant editor for. We have autistic people, actually, I have 3 copies, the last 3 copies of the preview issue, and then a bunch of little flyers if you want them afterwards. So we have autistic people involved on the editorial board as reviewers and as authors, and we're looking for article submissions, including insights from autistic and other non-scientist community members. And also, I don't know, you might find us useful. And now I guess I'm happy to take questions on the autistic burnout research, and also I'm happy to discuss community-engaged approaches to research or collaborating with autistic adults and young adults, or any of Aspire's other work with employment, healthcare. Your turn.
Great. Thank you, Dora. First of all, round of applause. Thank you very much, Dora. We'll take some questions in the audience here, while also people that have questions via Facebook Live start typing them away. We're taking them down, and we'll get to those questions as we tabulate some of those questions. Anybody in the audience here that has a question, I'll bring you the microphone. I see one in the back. I'll come up to you, and we'll have plenty of time for various questions.
Hey, do you believe opportunity cost comes into play when autistics experience burnout, especially the more prolonged episodes or pivotal times, or where takes longer to recover? Do you think there's opportunity cost in that they're not able to invest as much of themselves, or at the same level, or in these opportune windows?
Can you define opportunity cost for me?
Opportunity cost would be like, if, as an example, if I had $100 versus if I had 10, I'd be able to invest more of it, and then ideally get more equity back, be able to invest more than if I had 10. I'd only be able to invest this much and only be able to maybe recoup or profit this much, and I'm playing with a much smaller reserve, or
Is the idea that if you have less of a resource, investing any piece of it is actually a bigger commitment than if you have more of the resource?
Yeah, like if you're held back at any point in any way from something, that would be the cost of opportunity. You would lose some of what would have been, or entirely all of, an opportunity that someone with more resources would have had.
Opportunity cost is a very economic term. I wonder, how do you apply it to this?
Let's
Talking about, like, say, for example, opportunity cost actually to cope and mask myself, or do I use my resources in getting things done? Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yeah.
You'd have to take pause from one's career, or it just be that much more you couldn't invest in areas of your life. You're having to focus on self-care and recovery.
So I can answer. I mean, I'm not going to answer from the research at this moment. I'm going to just sort of answer from my own experience, which is very much yes. Like, I make terrible choices all the time because I've got maybe the same amount as everybody, but this much is going to disability management, and they don't have that going on. So, I mean, I have a kind of underlying idea that this autistic burnout may actually be a broader disability burnout phenomena. I don't. That's not what we looked at, but I would say, at least for myself, yeah. And I do think that the economic analogy, if you're thinking of resources as a quantifiable thing that you can put into a model, those resources could be your spoons. The spoon theory, for anyone who doesn't know it, is this idea that when you live with a disability, you wake up with a certain amount of spoons, and you have to use a bunch of those spoons just to do these basic necessities, and then you're left with like 2 spoons, and you have to figure out what to do with them. Whereas most people who don't have to do all this disability management, they have all those spoons throughout the whole day that they can use as they will. So I think it gets into that kind of idea. So I mean, I would say, yeah, I think so.
So, actually, circling back and making it an economic issue, did you do any research in terms of people from lower income households? Like, I was a full-time student and working, and I crashed and burned. It was horrible. I could not keep up. Everything stopped. So, has there been any information collection as far as income, and if certain people with privilege potentially burn out less? I mean, I'm not saying that people of higher privilege don't burn out. I'm asking if there was any differentiation there.
So the sample wasn't big enough or quantitative enough to do an analysis that would differentiate. I can say, so for the employment interviews, we did ask about income, and even though we were talking to professionals, it was still pretty low income group. I mean, this is in the realm of health disparities, and when you're marginalized in one area, it cascades all the way through. So in general, it's always been a lower income sample than the general population would be. We didn't ask that question of the people we did the burnout interviews of, so I don't have a sense for that. The employment people that we talked to, where we do know that, some people who had higher socioeconomic status actually had worse burnout problems because what they were struggling to maintain had more riding on it. Like, the moment you get that higher paying job and you get that mortgage and you get that stuff, but then the people who were from lower incomes also had different stresses. So I don't know, it would take more work to really answer just qualitatively. It kind of is bad no matter what circumstance you're in, because there's always some kind of struggle to hold pieces together.
I actually have 2 questions. With the dynamics system, do you guys look at having other illnesses and disabilities and physical problems outside the spectrum contributing as a stressor? Because I have a constellation of things that definitely take a lot of spoons, and then that makes dealing with the autism worse, and then that makes dealing with those worse. And it didn't seem like I don't know if maybe that was part of the social and financial rewards.
That wasn't in the model, but it wasn't. I mean, the model is an oversimplification. That's what a model is, kind of by definition, is like, we're going to take out all the details that make this real life so that we can try to understand what's even going on here. Those system dynamics models like that actually can get really huge with like hundreds of little bubbles in them. And if I were to make, more complex ones, which actually I hope to, because I'm a dork and I love system dynamics models, but that would absolutely be a bubble for that, because it was in the interviews. Like, people did talk about that. They did talk about having to manage other disabilities and mental health conditions, making it much harder to prevent a burnout, and then also the burnout making it much harder to take care of this. So that those feedbacks were absolutely in the stories that people told us.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, you were talking about when you were testing things and they had problems with executive function and things like that. Did you do any official like neuropsychology testing, like the color word thing or recall? Okay.
No, these were just interviews. So we sat down with a person. We had a list of structured questions, and so the first question was something along the lines of like, okay, so you said that you've had an experience of autistic burnout. If you've had more than one, we can talk about more than one, but start with the one that seems the most important to you, and just tell me the story of what happened. Like, how did the burnout happen? How did it make you feel? Like, so it was really, kind of structured, and then we'd have a conversation. And then the next question was, so how would you define autistic burnout? So it was much more, what you do is you have a conversation that's structured in order to get at the kind of information that you're interested in, which is what is people's experience of this thing, and then you analyze that data. So and it's a rigorous scientific way that you analyze it, but it's also relatively subjective. It's kind of like when you're doing English class and you're kind of like summarizing key points that are in essays that you've read. That's sort of how the analysis goes. It's got a rigorous structure to it, but
Is it in there? No. Yes. Yes. The journal that Dr. Raymaker was referencing is now in the comment section of the Facebook Live, just for all you people watching. Any other questions in the room here before we jump into some Facebook Live questions? Let's see if I can. I'm going to jump over you, and then there we go.
Going back to the spoon analogy, is there any way to start the day with more spoons, like exercise, anti-anxiety medication? In other words, can you build up your reserves so you can go longer and you don't get exhausted as soon?
I don't know. I mean, I think that, I don't have an official clinical answer to that. I mean, I have ways that I store up my spoons. I had to store up a lot of spoons for this talk. And I don't know that my ways of storing up spoons would work for your ways of storing up spoons.
The simple
But
answer is yes, but it doesn't work for everyone.
yeah.
Everyone's different, and every has a cost associated. For example, use Adderall. Great. Helper for a spoon, but it's also a huge detriment at the same time.
There's a lot of trial and error, I think.
I actually, one of the things that was in the big flyer that we can't read very well, but is a sensory diet. So
Was
you
it
can-
this flyer? 'Cause
Yeah.
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 Do you want to read it better? Because I can.
Well,
pass
I
this
know
out.
it's on there. I've seen it before.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, sensory diet. So, and like just protecting yourself sensory wise, can help you conserve spoons. Like for me, if I like wear my sunglasses and my earplugs and my hat when I go outside, I'm not as drained. And then I have more energy to do something else. And some other things like that you can do to increase spoons are like other sensory diet stuff, like for me, proprioception things like bouncing up and down on a ball, you know, like those exercise balls. It like builds me up, gives me some energy. But that's definitely something to look into if you want to help increase your energy.
My work desk has one of those balls, and people are always kind of like, don't understand in video conferences why they see me doing this.
So I just wanted to also share that the slide you put up from the Autism Women's Network, we were able to get that link. So that link is also available within the Facebook comments.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you for centering autistic experience as the experts in your research. I think that that's so important. And I also like that you're shifting the intervention spotlight a little bit externally and saying, hey, since the autistic experience is so individualized, it's so different, why are our interventions so formulaic? And we should look outside of the individual and look at what's happening around them and maybe normalize some of these spoon refilling activities so that they are easier to access and we can cope a little bit better. And I also cannot help but think about how this flood of feedback from autistics kind of flies in the face of what our current standard of intervention is, especially for young people, and especially what people have access to through insurance. It's behavioral training at this point, and I think that doesn't align with this goal of reducing the expectation to be neurotypical or to present as neurotypical. So I hope that this shifts the conversation a little bit more toward how we can change the way that people have access to therapies and to interventions that are a little more well-rounded in their approach. So thank you.
I hope so too. And I also feel strongly, and also the rest of the community partners in Aspire feels really strongly about this because we've had discussions about it, that service interventions almost often put the additional burden of doing something back on the disabled person or back on the autistic person. So I know that I personally am really interested. That's why the employment research, I'm kind of looking at workplace culture change, which is something that we do know something about and have used with other populations like veterans, is to like get that, like, let's not put one more burden to do a thing on us, but shift that burden a little bit to the possibly more, quote, able environment. So I hope so. I hope that shift continues. I've seen, I've been at this for 12 years now, and it has changed faster than I ever dreamed for the better at the start. So I think there's hope.
So I just like to say thank you. This is the first time that I've seen something presented in such a precise and accurate manner that describes what I, and I'm sure a lot of other people, go through all the time. And this research to me is extremely important. I hope you continue on with it. Thank you.
And thank you for showing up. Like, this is like the best room I've ever talked to. Like, it's all a room of my own people. So it's nice. It's nice to have your questions and thoughts. I like your thoughts too.
I think we're running low on the Facebook Live questions, which is fine. But so any other more questions in the room, we can keep this going. This is a good discussion, I think.
But I have one question. So hello, thank you so much for being here. As a parent of a child with autism, and because I care for autistic people beyond my son and the community, looking at ways to relieve and prevent burnout. I hope to hear a little bit now, and I've heard a lot already, but if we can keep that research going so people like me can have things at our fingertips to help relieve some of that and prevent it for our loved ones.
Thank you. Thank you. That was I love hearing that. And I hope that we can continue this too. You know, this is the very start, and this is the part where we're having to prove to the larger, you know, funders like the NIH that yes, this is a thing, and yes, this is a problem. And sometimes you have to back up and do this kind of really preliminary work just to say, okay, no, this is really something we have to address, kind of like what happened with the healthcare study where like, we're not going to fund you because we don't know that autistic people have worse healthcare. So, so that's kind of the stage we're at with this research right now, but I also think that you can benefit, I mean, obviously right away from the discussion that's going on within the community and within this room, and you don't have to wait for the research. I mean, research is frustrating. There's a lot of good about research. I do research for a reason, but it's also really slow. And there are more immediate answers out there in the wisdom of the community in this room.
Hi, so we have one question from Facebook. This is from Jen, and she's wondering, what do you say to people when they say, oh, you just need to take a break? There's always respite. For her, respite isn't always the answer or available.
Is this
she is a mom.
Respite from her child? Or respite, or her child needs, I'm sorry.
I will ask her.
I'm not, because I can't necessarily answer it from a parent's point of view.
We'll come back to that in a second. We'll get that
Okay.
clarification. Have another one in the room here.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a child and family therapist, so a provider and also a parent. And I was curious, I know you said research takes a while, but how soon can providers expect to see the scale or measure to use for autistic burnout? I'm thinking of many child and family therapists would look at someone experiencing autistic burnout and think it's depression. And if the autistic person wasn't able to label it in the way that so many other folks can, and then the interventions would lead towards things that wouldn't necessarily be helpful. So I'm just curious how soon we might see something that we could use in a clinical setting.
So let's assume that everything goes great with the pilot. Like, let's assume that we have an awesome pilot and the constructs hold together and it looks like it could potentially be a valid measure. If everything goes smoothly, then there should be a paper out on that, I would say, mid-next year. So the research itself, the grant that's funding this work is up in October. And you're never really done when the grant ends. But we should pretty shortly after that be able to start compiling stuff. And then, you know, you never know how long it's going to take for the paper to get written and for it to get published. But I'm lucky enough that I currently have gotten a grant that's going to protect a lot of my time. So I'm hoping I can use that to actually get these papers out in a timely manner. What's going to come out first, though, which may also be helpful, is that this fall, I'm hoping to get the paper on this work out. So this work, like what I just reported on here, the qualitative piece, we're really, really close to done with this analysis. And as soon as we're done, we're hoping to get a paper out. So there'll be probably 2 papers from this. One is just on this, so that you can use that to show people, like, here's a thing and here's how they're characterizing it. And then the measure will come, you know, sometime later. But you probably won't need to wait a year. I mean, if it's terrible, if the measure bombs and we need to go back to the drawing board, it's science. We don't really know the answers to anything until we see the data.
So kind of back to Jen's question about needing respite. So she is the parent of a child with high needs, and another person has also commented as well that they also have a son who is severely autistic. And she has mentioned throughout the comments that she is experiencing burnout with caring for her son. So when people are telling her that she, you know, should just take a break and respite is the cure, is there she's looking for some sort of guidance on how to answer those questions or those responses. And I don't know if I'm kind of looking around if anyone else
I'm wishing right now that I could teleport the burnout expert who's on my team into this room to answer that question, because that's what she does. I don't particularly have expertise in, I mean, I'm a systems scientist, and this is, that is, caregiver burnout is outside the scope of this, and caregiver burnout also has a lot of work that's been done on it. So I think there might be some resources out there. When I was, preparing the grant proposal for this work, I did a big lit search on autism and burnout and every possible combination that you could come up with on autism and burnout, and got back, I'm not going to say like thousands upon thousands of articles, but there were a pretty substantial amount of articles that came back on caregiver burnout, teacher burnout, disability provider burnout, parent-family burnout. So I know that it is a thing and there are resources out there. I know that's not a very helpful answer, but it's a little bit outside the scope of what I do.
Just say something. I'm a family advocate at the Autism Center, and I work with parents to help them find respite. So I can connect with Jen later, because really the talk tonight is about autism burnout. And Jen may have misunderstood that, and I'm happy to chat with people online about local respite opportunities for parents, many who suffer stress levels that of combat soldiers, like many of you in this room who've suffered stress, and not because of you. We love you, and I'm sorry that it's just sometimes raising a kid with severe autism is stressful, but it doesn't mean we don't love our children dearly. The other thing I wanted to say is. And this is a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it just because I want to. It's kind of we're at this interesting time in this really groundbreaking research. That if we talk about the remedy to this, how we can relieve and prevent it, some might say that could be the reduction in therapies, and not such a bad thing, right? Because sometimes therapy can cause stress.
Or it could just be different therapies,
right? And I would say, as a parent of a severely affected child, the therapies have saved him in some ways. He can cross the street safely. He can ask for what he wants. But I always have to grapple as a parent, did that cause him more stress than the ability that gave him? So we as parents have to ask these questions. Mm-hmm. Did the stress level caused by the therapy, did it pay off in the skill he got? So as scientists and providers think about it, parents also have to weigh that out and have tools to weigh it out.
Well, and we have to weigh it out too. There was an interesting piece of one of the interviews where the person was talking about learning like when it was necessary to mask and when it wasn't, as an important part of kind of her equilibrium process. And the interview went on about like, wouldn't it be good not to mask, and like, well, but you have to sometimes. And I mean, I think that neurotypical people also have to mask sometimes. Like, I don't think this is necessarily a like black and white either or. I think there are some times when it's kind of not safe to be yourself, even if it has nothing to do with autism. So I wouldn't say like, this is just terrible, don't ever do it. And sometimes you really don't have a choice about what life is throwing at you too. But I think that you don't need to do that all the time in every, if you can get a job where the job doesn't care if you sometimes work under your desk, then, which true story from my life, then that's good. That's not a time when you absolutely have to, the way you might absolutely have to safely cross the street. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that was one of the things that the person was talking about in the interview was, I think that piece of the interview might have been the advice for other autistic people portion, if I'm remembering correctly. And that was her thing of like, we need to kind of get a better grasp on learning how to teach each other when it's important to put the mask up and when it's not. Like, it was kind of that determination skill of when to use it and when not to that she was talking about, which I'd like a world where we do less of it, but we live in this world, so as we shift the system, we have to make hard decisions about where the spoons go.
First off, thank you for actually listening to us to people about when they say, no, this is not depression, it's different. Mm-hmm. Having both, I have been arguing with so many doctors for years now that no, what's happening now It's not my depression. I know what that feels like. But going on from that, with things that maybe help get the burnout better, has anyone had, with everyone going, oh, well, it's depression, has anyone had any success with the typical things they tell you for depression? Well, even if you don't feel like it, you need to go out and exercise or just get up and do things anyway. Has anyone had success with that, or has that been counterproductive?
Don't take this as hard science. My sense for that, and I'll kind of in a large part coming from my own personal experience, is no.
That's been my experience.
Because, you know, in depression, it's like you have to kind of snap yourself out of a funk, right? Which is really different from a legitimate exhaustion. Which is like, no, I really am worn down to a nub. And adding one more thing isn't going to snap you out of it. It's just going to wear you down past the nub. And I don't take this as scientific or clinical. This is kind of me just having a normal conversation.
It's just nice to have someone else go, yeah.
But I can say in the interviews, nobody said that. Like, nobody there are things like exercise and doing things that helped, but it was in the context of, because it's my special interest, because it's a STEM, because it helps my sensory diet. Like, people were doing the things because they were connected to the things that fed them, the things that gave them energy instead of the things that took it away.
Thank you.
Pure exercise, with no change in diet and no change in anything, would definitely deplete your energy levels. But like, I was 103 pounds like 2 years ago, and then I kind of go through these little spurts, 200, 130, whatever. But you need to change your diet as well to maintain that energy level to you. So it's so many little factors that you need to correspondingly move around. I feel, and so it's like one change, yeah, but then you might have to change something else as well. So, yeah, like exercise has worked for me, but it also I need to do a bunch of other things to maintain that energy level. Otherwise, I will burn out really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I exercise a lot and it helps me, but it's also a STEM, so it's.
I totally agree with what you said, and this is something I like to talk about a lot. Like, I've been through burnout and like feeling depressed and thinking I was depressed and going through the treatment for that. And I found that all of the like positive affirmations and like coping skills that you learn for depression were things that I already knew and I was already doing. And like, I could try doing those till I was blue in the face, and it just wouldn't really decrease my exhaustion or make me feel better. And what I found that has helped a lot is letting myself delve into special interests and things that I'm passionate about. Now I feel like zero depression, and I've just been writing and just doing whatever interests me, which I wasn't letting myself do before. Mm-hmm. And also like sensory stuff too. Just like, I think those are really the things to focus on for us being autistic, rather than like putting a positive sticky note affirmation on your mirror. Like, that only goes so far.
Maybe that goes into the social expectations thing, because everyone gives you this list of, here's the things to do, and you're like, I already know all of that. It's not working.
And those things, I can say, are supported in our science. So like, when people are talking about how did you get out of the burnout, and they're like that's what they're talking about, is special interests, sensory diet, stimming, hanging out with other autistic people, hanging out with people who accept them, and like all of those things are in the data, yeah.
So I like to circle back to things. We were on the topic of therapy, and I just wanted to let people know that the therapy I received taught me that I could never take off my mask. And it contributed significantly to my burnout, especially considering that until 3 years ago, I didn't know that I was autistic. I didn't know that I had sensory needs. And it wasn't until I was meeting those needs that I was actually able to attend college for the first time at the age of 29. So it's very important to teach people that they have autonomy, that they don't always have to mask, that they are allowed to stim, because it is crucial to our development as human beings. And that's all I wanted to add on that subject.
And non-autistic people stim too. It's just socially acceptable when they do it. If you ever tap your pencil or jiggle your leg.
I think we have time for maybe one more question or so as we start to wrap up. If there are, yeah, great. And then, well, as we disconnect from Facebook Live, then Dora's around to also maybe if there are people that don't have kind of questions that they want to put out there.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you. This is a revelation to me. I was diagnosed with autism about 6 months ago after an episode of what I now realize was really intense burnout. And so since I now know this about myself, I'm having to reevaluate a lot of different things. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the expectations and lowering the expectations. There was a slide, the caution that it does not mean reducing expectations about achieving goals. But is that realistic? I mean, am I going to be able to accomplish the things I thought I could accomplish in my life when I thought that I was allistic? It seems like there's a fine line between expectations and hope, and I'm wondering, how do you reduce expectations without reducing hope?
Yeah, I can't answer that without knowing the future, obviously. I don't know. I mean, I expect a lot out of, I have a kind of aggressive, hardcore career going on, but I also don't expect to do any part of it the way that a lot of other people would. And I also had to release a lot of expectations of what someone in my position should do. Like, I barely ever travel. If I actually want to be top researcher in the world on any of this stuff, it's probably never going to happen, and I've learned to kind of accept that. That doesn't mean that I can't have an impact. And I certainly, I have my bouncy ball at home. Everybody knows that I'm autistic. I work in the School of Social Work, where it's an environment. When I first started working in that department as a research assistant, I was actually working with somebody who also had a disability, and she changed all of the lights in her room without even asking me to like get rid of the fluorescent bad lights. And so I kind of knew that I had walked into an environment that was good. So I think there are ways that we can navigate and find spaces where we can find our dreams. Part of this slide was a reaction to a lot of people get told, oh, your child's autistic, that means they're never going to amount to anything in life. And I wanted to make sure that that wasn't what we were talking about. Yeah, there was another thread I was going to say about that. I kind of lost it for a sec. Yeah, I would say that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, give yourself time and patience to re-navigate that identity. And now I'm on Facebook Live, so I'm all very self-conscious about what I say and what I disclose here. But I would not have gotten into research if I hadn't also had a significant burnout that led to a diagnosis, that led to loss of job, that led to a lot of stuff. And I remember even my special interests hurting for a while. It was so bad. and I have a lot of bits of privilege too, and was able to re-navigate myself into this situation that is actually very carefully designed to reduce my risk of burnout, right? I am in absolute control of my schedule. I am in absolute control of my physical environment. I get to choose who I work with. So it was very kind of carefully constructed to not require that masking stuff. I still feel like there was something I wanted to say, but if I think of it later, but be forgiving with yourself while recovering, because it's, yeah, just do.
We have one final question from Facebook. This is from Mike. So I'm going to read his question exactly. I am 28 years old and I was diagnosed in 2016 and I have begun to disassociate whenever I mask. I also burn out more easily. I am perfectly fine in my comfort zone, but once I need to mask, it's as if I'm taking control of the mask in the third person in order to exist in the real world. Is there any research that notes the lack of self in a masking?
Not that I know of, but I love that question, and I hope that I'm glad that it's getting recorded because I'd like to return to that. I think that's a very good question, and I can ask the burnout people on my team because there might be something that's been done in other populations around that. I think that's an interesting and important question that I don't have the answer to, but I'm glad you asked it.
Thank you. So would it be, we have included within the link at the end your contact information that you had to your website and your email address. So we will, Mike, if you're listening, if you could please connect with Dora there, that would be fantastic, and hopefully more to come on that research.
I think you all can hear. There you go. Now it's on. I know. Well, I asked for a round of applause last time, and that maybe is a negative sensory experience, but maybe we'll do the I like this. This is a good. So everybody, give a nice little wave for Dr. Rainmaker, and thank you so much for coming. And we'll hopefully see you next month. Have another great Autism 200 series, and the sun's still out there. Hopefully, maybe the rain's gone. Cross your fingers when you get out there, and have a great evening. Thanks.